Well, nice to see you again, Peter, and thanks for having me. I think for the US right now, Starmer has come over. He's tried to soften the ground as best as he can for what is ultimately the ask of American military presence in Ukraine after the ceasefire and after the war ends. And that's, as one of your listeners or viewers mentioned, President Trump might think of it as too little, too late. 0.2% of GDP over 3 years is not that big of a sum in President Trump's mind. So I think what's at stake will be like in practical terms, kind of how is this relationship going to work for the next 4 years? Because if Starmer's going to come over, ask for this big ask that instinctively President Trump is kind of going to be against, like President Trump might just ask for more, and I really want to see how Starmer plays that one.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I should say there are lots of Marines, or what appear to be Marines, with flags having a sort of honour
Those are
guard
Marines, yeah.
for Keir Starmer coming. So I think his arrival is pretty imminent, I would imagine. I may have to interrupt you in a second, Michael, when that happens. Just in regard to the increase from 2.3% of what the country makes to 2.5% that Keir Starmer has committed to, there'll be a lot of pressure, I'm sure, in this meeting from President Trump to get that up, perhaps even double it to 5%. That is certainly what President Trump has wanted. He thinks that there's so many European allies that are way behind. And all of this, I would imagine from your perspective as well, Michael, it does feed in to the discussions around Ukraine. What do you think of that conversation?
Yeah, I think President Trump's treating it like a negotiation, right? He wants a higher number and he wants it faster. And I think that whenever he would come to visit the UK, that would be his and his team's first question is
Hmm.
what is the UK spending on defense? And I think he's going to continue to press that point before even, I think, engaging with the idea of putting US troops in Ukraine or U.S. Planes or anything like this. So I think in practical terms, he's going to be briefed by everybody, both in D.C. and the embassy here, about what Starmer's been up to, how is he positioning himself ahead of this. So he's going to know, and he's going to treat it as a negotiation. He's going to try and get defense spending up because that is what he cares about in the UK.
What do you think he could give away? It's interesting that, or if anything, because Keir Starmer has been asking all sorts of questions and raising the spectre of things like a backstop, a form of military backup system, essentially, when it comes to Ukraine and what Britain and France want to do there.
Yeah, I think President Trump is going to be instinctively opposed to a backstop because ultimately they are Starmer and Macron are asking for an American military presence in Ukraine, and that is President Trump. He is consistent. He's been consistently against that idea. So I think in order to get that, if they were going to press that point, there has to be more of an ask. Like Macron coming over and fact checking and saying you're making a mistake, I don't think that's necessarily the right move. I think Starmer's done it a bit better in the sense of, he's announced an increase. He's talking about investment into the U.S. from big British tech companies, stuff like that. Like that's great, but ultimately, then it's like what's in it for President Trump
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
his foreign policy agenda for putting American hard power in Ukraine. And so far, I don't think Starmer has done a good enough job of answering that because in President Trump's mind, this is a European problem, not an American problem.
Yes, and I would imagine there are many members of his administration and even Democrats who believe that as well. I wonder how seriously Keir Starmer will be taken because we've had this shuttle diplomacy, this conveyor belt of leaders from Europe. You've had Macron earlier this week, a number of calls between Macron and Starmer. They've planned a meeting of various leaders next week. We know as well that Zelensky is coming tomorrow. Surely that's the main event this week, more so than the UK Prime Minister.
Yeah, I think Zelensky is. I think that's going to be the big negotiation, right? Because I think President Trump has been clear that I think he wants American companies to have access to Ukrainian markets post ceasefire, and he's framing it as a form of economic deterrence. And I think there's merit in that argument, in the sense of, imagine his bulldog in chief, Elon Musk, opens up a Tesla factory in Ukraine. I imagine Russia might think twice before bombing a Tesla factory, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah, yeah.
So
This whole idea, I mean, it's a very, very interesting point. And this whole idea of what security guarantees actually are, my impression of that, and you're the expert, Michael, but my impression of that is that that can be a much more fluid concept than simply saying, right, it's boots on the ground, or it's drones in the air, or it's spy planes.
yeah, I think from President Trump's perspective, it's hard. It'll be difficult to commit to those things because, in many ways, the deal hasn't been done on any side. And I actually think it's important that Zelensky is going because Putin is also trying to offer mineral deals to the U.S. in a way that would undermine Ukrainian sovereignty. These are minerals that are in Russian occupied but Ukrainian territory, right? So I think it's important that Zelensky is going ahead of Putin and that at least Trump's approach, his negotiation tactic, although consistent of like aiming for the stars, maybe landing on a cloud for him, but it is softening. Like there is the softening away of the 500 billion and this, and now it's more about like, okay, how do we get American access into Ukrainian markets? And I think as that dialogue progresses and as the tone changes, there is going to be scope here for Ukrainian and European wins. It's just a matter of like threading that needle. Because in my opinion, actually the Russia doesn't have a plan B. Like Putin's been waiting 4 years for President Trump to come to power. So
Hmm,
like
hmm.
if if Europe and Zelensky and everybody play this well and end up getting, you know, kind of what they want or something like this, then the biggest person that Trump has leverage over, in my mind right now, is actually Putin. And I think Starmer would do well to like press that point home
That's
because
very, very interesting. What kind of leverage do you think he would enact? How do you think Putin would dance to his tune? Because that is not an aspect that really so much of the Western security and I suppose media establishment really think would be the case. It's more to
yeah.
do with this idea of Trump sort of doing what Putin tells him to do, but actually it could well be the other way around.
If you think about it, Putin has staked a lot on the idea of Trump's return, right?
Hmm.
And the idea that President Trump would kind of do what he's doing now, right? But in practical terms, that gives President Trump a lot of leverage over Putin. So I think if you're Starmer and you press that point home, in some ways it's like bait. Like you can get President Trump, I think, to at least understand that he understands leverage clearly.
Hmm. Hmm.
So um, and I think it was the former head of MI6 that made this point a few weeks ago that I thought was really interesting because it's like you have this unique moment, and we're all focusing on the Zelensky angle and the European angle, but I also think there's the Russian angle because if you look at the rhetoric coming out of Russia and Putin right now, it's much more docile. It's almost absent in some ways, which is very different than before when it was President Biden, where it was much more combative, saber rattling. Now I think they're trying like, they're kind of walking on eggshells because they don't want the attention.
Yeah, it's fascinating actually in regard to that. I should say we are moments away, where we think anyway. There are lots of people with flags. I think that's the flag of Maryland, if I remember correctly. That
The
is on.
wire, right?
That is on the front. I used to live in Maryland, so I think that is
Okay.
correct. At the foreground of the shot there, we see some different photographers there as well. We've got the Stars and Stripes, the US flag, of course, and the Union flag there. Keir Starmer is about 15 minutes late. I imagine he is coming from the British Embassy or from the Great House, which is where the UK ambassador Lord Mandelson now lives, the residence there. He will be coming to the White House for these discussions with Donald Trump. We are on air now and will be for that arrival. And Michael Martins is with me. He's a former political specialist at the US Embassy in London. I wonder, Michael, what your thoughts are in regard to the differences. I know you worked for the embassy during the first Trump administration. What are your impressions of the second Trump administration and how it's been, 35 days now, how different it is from the first one?
Excellent. Great question, Pete. I think so. I think instinctively, I don't think the instincts have changed. The big difference is organization and loyalty. I think he has a lot more loyalists and that are capable around him, and they have a clear agenda of what they want to do. And it's as weird as it sounds, it's less chaotic than his first term. It's clear that, they had executive orders lined up, they had nominees lined up, they knew what they wanted. And that is, his first term, it was almost like a surprise in some ways. It felt like it. And that was much more chaotic. And I think he was also trying to bring a bit more legitimacy into his first term by, if you remember the rotating cast of generals and that type of thing. Like,
Yes.
remarkably, it's been over a month and he hasn't fired anyone. Like, I think that's different than his first
Yes,
term.
well,
So,
certainly, Anthony Scaramucci, he lasted what, 11 days or something
yeah,
along those lines.
it
Yes,
lasted longer than it takes to like upload a video on YouTube. Yeah.
certainly in 2016 anyway. It's interesting with those characters. I mean, we do have, there's some, especially in Ukraine, there are some aspects of this where there are different people saying different things. Pete Hegseth, for example, the US Defense Secretary, saying slightly different things from Keith Kellogg, the general who's the special envoy to Ukraine. Even Trump himself saying initially that he didn't think that Zelensky would be part of the discussions, then saying it's important that Zelensky actually sits down and talks with Putin. From someone who worked in the US Embassy, how difficult was that actually to navigate when you had contradictory things coming out of the senior people?
Yeah, it definitely kept us on our toes. I think, in many ways, because a lot of the harder parts of it would be when we were engaging with our counterparts in the British government, and the British civil service is a very professional and capable place. They were kind when we
Okay.
had changed some of our
Sorry,
talking points mid-meeting.
sorry to interrupt you, Michael. I think it's just fair to say that President Donald Trump is now at the front door of the White House. There is a Marine who is saluting there, and we expect Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, to be there very, very soon indeed. We know that he is going to be greeted there by the President Donald Trump. That is not something that always happens. We can see what the Americans call a motorcade, where there is a long limousine that has both American flags, the Stars and Stripes, and the UK flag there. And Keir Starmer has just arrived and he is shaking the hands of President Trump. The two men are greeting each other warmly. They are smiling. They are gesturing
Trump,
toward.
can you get a peace deal done in Ukraine? Yes. How confident are you, sir?
So there was a question, they're just going inside the White House now, and there was a question from a reporter there asking, can you get a peace deal done in Ukraine? And President Trump appeared, from what I heard and what I saw, for him to say, yes, I believe we can. That's certainly consistent with everything else he said previously. And they have now gone inside the White House. They will have a series of meetings there. There'll be a press conference, a lot of discussion, of course, over the next few hours. Michael Martins was joining me there. We're going to say thank you to him. He is a former political specialist at the US Embassy in London.